For the last several years, the entire conversation about the United States losing ground to China in technology has revolved around one word: chips. Whoever builds the fastest artificial intelligence processors, whoever can produce the most advanced silicon, whoever controls the supply chain for the semiconductors powering modern data centers, was assumed to win the 21st century. Washington poured billions of dollars into that race, restricted exports, subsidized domestic chip factories, and treated every new Chinese processor announcement as a national security alarm bell. But something just shifted inside the Pentagon that suggests the United States may be quietly changing its entire theory of how this competition gets won. Instead of only trying to outbuild China chip for chip, America's top military research and technology leadership just elevated quantum computing to sit alongside artificial intelligence as one of the defining pillars of future military power. Washington is no longer just racing China on processors. It is trying to leap past the entire chip competition altogether. And that decision could reshape who actually wins the technology war of the next decade. To understand why this shift matters, you first have to understand exactly how intense the chip side of this competition has become, because it explains why Pentagon planners are suddenly looking for another path forward. For years, the United States tried to slow China's artificial intelligence ambitions by restricting access to the most advanced semiconductor technology, cutting off shipments of cutting-edge processors and the specialized manufacturing equipment needed to produce them domestically. The logic seemed straightforward at the time: deny China the world's best chips, and its artificial intelligence development would inevitably fall behind. What actually happened tells a very different story. Rather than crippling China's ambitions, the restrictions forced a massive wave of domestic investment, and the results have been faster than almost anyone predicted. China's own share of domestically produced artificial intelligence chips meeting its internal demand has climbed dramatically, moving from roughly 1/5 of total demand just a few years ago to well over 40% today, with projections suggesting the country could be meeting the overwhelming majority of its own chip needs before the end of the decade. Huawei alone is projected to see its artificial intelligence chip revenue surge by more than half this year, while other domestic chip designers have posted revenue growth in the thousands of percent as government-mandated procurement policies push Chinese companies to buy homegrown processors instead of foreign alternatives. This is the uncomfortable reality Pentagon planners are now grappling with. The tool the United States relied on to slow China down may have actually accelerated the very outcome it was designed to prevent. Chinese data center operators are now required to source the overwhelming majority of their core hardware domestically, and Chinese corporate executives report they intend to dramatically increase the share of their technology budgets spent on homegrown processors over just the next year. Meanwhile, new chip fabrication plants tied to leading domestic manufacturers are coming online in waves, with advanced production lines doubling their capacity and pushing toward increasingly sophisticated manufacturing processes that were once considered years beyond China's reach. Some independent analysts now estimate that China's dependence on foreign processors could fall to a small fraction of its current level, well before 2030, a timeline that would have sounded implausible only a couple of years ago. In other words, the chip race that Washington assumed it could win simply by restricting access has turned into a grinding, expensive standoff where China keeps closing the gap faster than expected, and simply doubling down on the same strategy no longer guarantees the same advantage it once did. That reality appears to be exactly why the Pentagon's senior technology leadership just made a deliberate strategic pivot, choosing to elevate an entirely different frontier rather than only doubling down on the chip race it has been fighting for years. The Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering recently outlined 6 critical technology areas the Department of War says will define American military strength for decades to come, and quantum technology now sits at the very center of that list, positioned specifically around what officials describe as battlefield information dominance. That framing matters enormously because it signals the Pentagon is not simply chasing quantum computing as a scientific curiosity. It is treating quantum technology as a direct answer to some of the exact vulnerabilities that a chip-focused strategy alone cannot solve. Resilient communications and navigation systems capable of resisting jamming and electronic attack sit at the heart of this new quantum priority, addressing a battlefield reality where satellite-dependent systems have become an obvious and heavily targeted weak point for any advanced military. This is not an isolated announcement sitting off to the side of broader defense policy. It is being backed by direct executive action reaching the highest levels of government. A recent set of executive orders specifically aimed at accelerating the country's pivot toward quantum-resistant encryption and reprioritizing federal investment toward the domestic quantum computing industry has already been signed, alongside a companion directive ordering the Pentagon to identify and begin fielding advanced quantum-enabled sensor projects within the next few years. The Department of War has since published its own overarching strategy, explicitly built around preparing for what it calls a future battle space enabled by cryptographically relevant quantum computers, a technical term for a quantum machine powerful enough to break the encryption protecting most of today's sensitive military and government communications. That strategy sets hard deadlines, requiring the department's own systems to either support quantum-resistant encryption standards or be phased out entirely within the next several years, a timeline that reflects genuine institutional urgency rather than a distant hypothetical concern. It is worth pausing here to explain why quantum computing represents such a fundamentally different kind of threat and opportunity compared to the chip race that has dominated headlines for years. Classical computing chips, no matter how advanced, still operate using the same basic binary logic that has powered computers for generations, ones and zeros processed at increasingly blistering speeds. Quantum computers work on an entirely different physical principle, using qubits that can represent multiple states simultaneously, giving them the theoretical ability to solve specific categories of problems that would take even the most powerful classical supercomputer thousands of years to complete. Code breaking sits near the top of that list of problems, which is exactly why a cryptographically relevant quantum computer represents such a serious national security concern. Modern encryption protecting financial systems, government communications, and military networks relies on mathematical problems that are essentially unsolvable for classical computers within any reasonable time frame, but that same math becomes vulnerable once quantum hardware reaches sufficient scale and reliability. This is precisely why the Pentagon's urgency around post-quantum cryptography cannot be separated from its parallel push into quantum sensing and quantum-enabled battlefield systems, because the department is racing against a threat that does not require it to lose the underlying chip competition to still suffer real damage. Intelligence officials have repeatedly warned about a strategy known as harvest now, decrypt later, where adversaries intercept and store encrypted military and government data today with no current ability to read it, simply banking on the assumption that quantum hardware capable of cracking that encryption will eventually exist. Under that scenario, sensitive communications, intercepted years before a quantum computer ever gets built, could still end up fully exposed the moment that hardware finally arrives, meaning the clock on this particular threat has already been running for years, regardless of how far away a functioning code-breaking quantum computer might currently be. That is the specific danger driving the Pentagon's decision to treat quantum readiness as an immediate operational priority rather than a distant research goal. Quantum sensing represents the more immediately practical half of this new strategy, and it is worth understanding why defense planners consider it the more mature and readily deployable half of the quantum equation. Unlike full-scale quantum computing, which still requires enormous engineering breakthroughs before it becomes practically useful, quantum sensors built around technologies like atomic clocks, gravimeters, and magnetometers are already approaching real-world deployment. These systems offer navigation and detection capabilities that do not depend on the kind of large-scale, fault-tolerant quantum computing still years away from maturity, and they can be integrated into existing military platforms without waiting for a complete quantum computing revolution to arrive first. Quantum-based timing and navigation systems, for example, offer a genuinely compelling solution to one of the most persistent vulnerabilities facing modern militaries: dependence on satellite-based positioning systems that adversaries can jam or spoof during actual conflict. Recent trials involving quantum clock-based networked systems have already demonstrated alternative navigation and timing capabilities that do not rely on space-based infrastructure at all, offering a level of resilience that traditional satellite-dependent systems simply cannot match once electronic warfare enters the picture. The financial commitment behind this pivot reinforces just how seriously this strategy is being treated at the highest levels of government. Washington has already committed more than $1 billion specifically toward quantum manufacturing. Foundries, alongside broader research and development funding, spanning everything from specialized cryogenic equipment needed to operate quantum hardware to entirely new fabrication approaches modeled on proven contract manufacturing techniques from the classical chip industry. Private capital has followed that lead at an even larger scale, with major financial institutions committing to massive, decade-long infrastructure initiatives that explicitly include quantum information science and technology as a core pillar alongside artificial intelligence investment. That kind of combined public and private momentum rarely gets thrown behind a technology unless serious institutional actors believe the underlying strategic logic has become too compelling to ignore, and it mirrors almost exactly the kind of coordinated funding push that powered the original chip manufacturing race years earlier. None of this means the Pentagon is abandoning the chip competition altogether, and it would be a mistake to read this quantum pivot as an admission of defeat on artificial intelligence hardware. Applied artificial intelligence remains one of the 6 critical technology areas driving the EU department's broader strategy, explicitly aligned with a wider national plan that continues to frame global artificial intelligence development as a direct competition with China. What has changed is the recognition that chips alone may not be enough to guarantee lasting military and technological superiority, especially now that China's domestic chip production has closed so much, ground so quickly. Rather than betting everything on a single competition that has become increasingly difficult to win outright, Washington appears to be diversifying its strategic bets, treating quantum technology as a parallel front where the United States still holds a meaningful research and engineering advantage that has not yet been eroded the way the chip advantage has. That advantage is not guaranteed to last forever, and China has made unmistakably clear that it views quantum technology with the same strategic urgency the United States now does. Chinese state media and government planning documents have repeatedly identified quantum computing as one of the country's core frontier technology priorities, backed by a national laboratory, structure specifically built to coordinate research across the country's top academic and scientific institutions. An approach that mirrors the same concentrated top-down funding model that has already produced such rapid gains across China's domestic chip industry. Beijing has committed staggering sums toward its broader technology development fund, with quantum research sitting among the priorities receiving support from that pool of capital, even as the exact scale of quantum-specific funding remains difficult to independently verify, given China's more centralized and less transparent approach to disclosing research spending. Major Chinese technology companies have continued developing their own quantum computing platforms and applications, ensuring the country maintains a credible presence across multiple competing quantum architectures, rather than relying on a single national champion the way it has increasingly done with artificial intelligence chip production. This dynamic creates an unusually complicated picture for anyone trying to predict how this broader technology competition ultimately plays out. On one hand, China's centralized, state-directed funding model has repeatedly proven capable of closing gaps faster than Western analysts initially expected, as the recent trajectory of its domestic chip industry has clearly demonstrated. On the other hand, quantum computing remains a fundamentally different kind of engineering challenge than conventional chip manufacturing, one where raw manufacturing capacity and government-mandated procurement policies matter far less than genuine scientific and engineering breakthroughs that cannot simply be willed into existence through funding alone. Some technology analysts have specifically noted that the nature of quantum competition is shifting away from a simple race toward the next isolated technical milestone, and increasingly toward a broader contest over who ultimately controls the supply chains, institutions, and technical standards through which quantum systems will eventually operate at scale. That distinction matters enormously, because it suggests the winner of this next phase of competition may be determined less by who achieves a single dramatic breakthrough first, and more by who builds the more resilient, better coordinated ecosystem of manufacturing, standards, and institutional support around the technology over the coming decade. A far less flashy, but ultimately more decisive kind of advantage than any single headline-grabbing announcement could ever provide. It is also worth acknowledging that this quantum pivot has not been entirely smooth sailing inside Washington itself, and recent friction between different parts of the federal government reveals just how high the stakes have become. Earlier this year, a significant dispute broke out between the Pentagon and the Federal Trade Commission over a major acquisition involving one of the country's leading quantum computing companies and a domestic chip manufacturer. Pentagon officials reportedly pushed hard behind the scenes for tougher restrictions on that deal, largely out of concern for protecting the government's own multi-billion-dollar direct investments in the quantum computing sector made earlier in the year. The Federal Trade Commission ultimately allowed the acquisition to proceed over those objections, with at least one commissioner arguing the deal was competitively neutral rather than harmful. That kind of internal disagreement over how aggressively to protect strategic quantum investments shows just how seriously different parts of the federal government now treat this sector, even when they disagree sharply on the right way to safeguard it. The broader strategic picture emerging from all of this suggests Washington has quietly concluded that winning the technology competition with China cannot rest on a single front alone. For years, the chip race absorbed the overwhelming majority of public attention, treated almost as the entire battlefield rather than one front among several. What the Pentagon's new emphasis on quantum computing reveals is a more sophisticated read of the situation, one that recognizes China's ability to rapidly scale. Domestic chip production has genuinely eroded the advantage the United States once assumed was permanent, while simultaneously identifying quantum technology as a frontier where meaningful advantage may still be preserved if the country moves quickly and decisively enough. Whether that bet pays off will depend on execution just as much as strategy, because quantum computing carries its own steep technical challenges that no amount of funding or political urgency can instantly solve. What makes this moment worth watching closely is how quickly the timeline pressure is compounding on both sides of this competition simultaneously. The Pentagon's own deadlines for transitioning away from vulnerable encryption standards stretch out only a few years into the future, meaning the systems being designed and deployed right now will need to already account for a quantum threat that may not fully materialize for years afterward. At the same time, China's chip self-sufficiency trajectory shows no sign of slowing, and every year that domestic Chinese manufacturing closes more ground on advanced processors is a year that narrows whatever advantage the United States still holds on the conventional side of this competition. Layered on top of both of those pressures is the quantum race itself, where neither country has yet demonstrated a fully mature, cryptographically relevant machine, leaving the door open for whichever manages to combine sustained funding, sound engineering strategy, and genuine scientific breakthroughs most effectively over the next several years. If you have made it this far, do not forget to like and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of shift that rarely makes mainstream headlines, but quietly reshapes how the next decade of global power actually gets decided. Diving deeper into how this quantum sensing push actually reshapes battlefield operations reveals why defense planners consider it such an immediate priority rather than a distant research goal. Modern militaries have spent decades building operations around satellite-based positioning, navigation, and timing systems, an architecture that works brilliantly in peacetime but becomes a glaring vulnerability the moment a serious adversary decides to contest that space. Electronic warfare capable of jamming or spoofing satellite signals has advanced dramatically over the past decade, and near-peer adversaries have invested heavily in exactly this kind of capability, specifically because and coordinated timing. Quantum sensors sidestep that vulnerability entirely by relying on the fundamental physical properties of atoms, rather than external signals that can be intercepted, jammed, or spoofed from a distance. An atomic clock built around quantum principles does not need to receive a signal from anywhere to maintain extraordinarily precise timing, and a quantum graviometer can detect subtle variations in gravitational fields to help determine position without ever needing to communicate with a satellite at all. That self-contained resilience is precisely why defense planners view quantum sensing as the most mature and immediately deployable piece of the entire quantum technology portfolio, a capability that does not require waiting for a fully realized, large-scale quantum computer to start delivering real operational value. The specific deadlines attached to this sensing push also reveal how seriously the Pentagon is treating the near-term timeline. Defense officials have been directed to identify and prioritize at least 3 next-generation quantum-enabled sensor projects, specifically intended for operational fielding within just a few years, a remarkably short runway for a technology that many outside observers still associate primarily with theoretical physics research rather than deployable hardware. That kind of compressed timeline signals genuine institutional confidence that quantum sensing technology has already crossed the threshold from laboratory curiosity into something closer to mature, fieldable engineering, even as the far more ambitious goal of a fully operational code-breaking quantum computer remains years or even decades further out on the horizon. Separating these 2 timelines matters enormously for understanding the Pentagon's overall strategy, because it explains why quantum sensing gets treated with such near-term operational urgency, while quantum computing itself is approached with a longer, more patient research and development posture built around benchmarking and rigorous technical validation rather than rushed deployment. This layered approach, moving quickly on sensing while taking a more measured, evidence-driven path on full-scale quantum computing, mirrors a broader lesson defense planners appear to have absorbed from watching the chip competition unfold over the past several years. Rushing toward headline-grabbing milestones without the underlying engineering maturity to back them up has repeatedly produced disappointing results across multiple technology sectors, while patient methodical investment in fundamentals has tended to produce more durable advantages over time. Applying that lesson to quantum technology means ready for near-term deployment right now, while others like fully fault-tolerant quantum computing require years of continued foundational research before they can responsibly be counted on for operational military use. That kind of nuanced, multi-speed strategy stands in fairly sharp contrast to the more binary, all-or-nothing framing that dominated much of the public conversation around the chip race, where every new processor announcement got treated as either a decisive win or a devastating loss in a single ongoing contest. Understanding the post-quantum cryptography deadlines in more detail also helps explain why this strategy carries such urgency, even though a fully operational code-breaking quantum computer may still be years away from actually existing. The Department of War's own published strategy requires that all of its systems either support quantum-resistant encryption standards or be phased out of service entirely within a defined multi-year window, with a broader deadline requiring full compliance across essentially all remaining systems shortly afterward. Meeting deadlines like that across an organization as vast and technologically complex as the modern American military is an enormous undertaking in its own right, involving everything from updating decades-old legacy communication systems to retraining personnel and rewriting technical standards across countless different platforms and programs. Officials overseeing this transition have been explicit that the initial network modernization steps represent only the first stage of a much longer preparation process, acknowledging publicly that fully readying the military for the eventual arrival of cryptographically relevant quantum computing will require sustained effort stretching well beyond these initial deadlines. That kind of candid acknowledgement matters because it reflects a level of institutional honesty about the scale of the challenge that was often missing from the earlier, more triumphalist rhetoric surrounding the chip competition. Rather than promising a quick, decisive technological knockout blow against China, the Pentagon's quantum strategy reads more like a methodical, multi-year campaign built around clearly sequenced milestones, hard deadlines, and honest acknowledgement of how much foundational work remains. That tonal shift alone may be one of the more significant signals buried inside this entire strategic pivot, suggesting that policymakers have learned real lessons from years of overpromising and underdelivering on emerging technology timelines, and are now trying to build a more sustainable, realistic framework for competing in a technology race that could easily stretch across multiple decades rather than resolving itself in a single dramatic breakthrough. The competitive picture becomes even more complex once you factor in how private industry is positioning itself around this shifting government strategy. Major American technology and financial companies have begun treating quantum information science as a distinct, investable category, sitting alongside artificial intelligence infrastructure rather than as a purely speculative, far-future research bet. That shift in private sector posture matters because it means government funding is no longer the only major source of capital flowing into quantum research and manufacturing. Private investment is increasingly following the same strategic logic driving public policy, treating quantum readiness as a near-term business necessity rather than a distant hypothetical. Companies operating in cloud computing, cybersecurity, and defense contracting have all begun building out dedicated quantum and post-quantum security practices, anticipating rising demand from both government agencies, racing to meet compliance deadlines, and private enterprises worried about protecting sensitive data against future decryption threats. That convergence of public policy urgency and private capital interest tends to accelerate technology development far more effectively than either government funding or private investment could achieve on its own. And it is precisely the kind of dynamic that powered earlier technology booms in sectors ranging from telecommunications to conventional semiconductor manufacturing. Meanwhile, the international dimension of this competition extends well beyond just the United States and China, adding another layer of complexity to how this broader technology race is likely to unfold. Other major economies have launched their own substantial national quantum strategies, committing billions of dollars over multi-year timeframes, specifically aimed at building sovereign quantum computing and manufacturing capability, rather than relying entirely on either American or Chinese technology. Allied nations pursuing independent quantum programs could end up playing a meaningful role in shaping the broader competitive landscape, either by contributing complementary research and manufacturing capacity that strengthens the American-led coalition, or by creating additional competitive pressure that pushes both Washington and Beijing to accelerate their own timelines even further. This kind of multipolar competitive dynamic, where more than just two countries are seriously investing in the same emerging technology, tends to produce faster overall progress across the entire field, even if it also makes predicting a single clear winner considerably more difficult than a simple two-country rivalry would suggest. Taken together, all of these threads point toward a technology competition that has grown considerably more complicated than the relatively straightforward chip race narrative that dominated public attention for years. Washington's decision to elevate quantum computing alongside artificial intelligence chips reflects a recognition that no single technology front guarantees lasting strategic advantage, and that durable technological leadership increasingly depends on successfully managing multiple parallel competitions at once, each moving at its own pace, each carrying its own distinct risks, and each requiring its own tailored strategy rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. Whether this more distributed, multi-front strategy ultimately proves more effective than the earlier, narrower focus on chip restrictions alone remains an open question, one that will likely take years to fully answer as both the quantum computing timeline and the ongoing chip competition continue evolving in parallel. What is already clear is that the era of treating semiconductor chips as the single defining battleground of the entire technology rivalry between these two Countries has quietly come to an end, replaced by a more complex multi-dimensional contest where quantum computing, post-quantum security, and next-generation sensing technology now sit alongside processors as equally critical fronts in a competition that shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon, and one where the next major headline is far more likely to come from a defense briefing or a research lab than from a flashy product launch event. There is also a workforce and talent dimension to this shift that rarely gets discussed but plays an enormous role in determining which country ultimately pulls ahead. Quantum computing and post-quantum cryptography require an extraordinarily specialized workforce combining deep expertise in physics, advanced mathematics, cryogenic engineering, and computer science in ways that few universities anywhere in the world are currently equipped to train at scale. The United States has historically benefited from its ability to attract top scientific talent from around the globe, including researchers. Originally trained in China, though tightening immigration and export control policies in recent years have made that talent pipeline considerably more complicated and politically sensitive than it once was. China, meanwhile, has poured enormous resources into building out its own domestic pipeline of quantum-trained scientists and engineers, coordinating research priorities across its national laboratory system in ways specifically designed to concentrate talent and resources around the government's stated strategic priorities. Which country ultimately builds the larger, more capable pool of specialized quantum talent over the coming decade may end up mattering just as much as which country spends more money or files more patents, because breakthrough physics and engineering problems of this magnitude are ultimately solved by people, not simply by funding alone. For everyday viewers trying to make sense of why any of this actually matters beyond abstract geopolitical competition, the practical stakes are more concrete than they might initially appear. Encryption standards protecting everything from online banking to personal medical records to critical infrastructure like power grids and water systems all rely on the same underlying mathematical assumptions that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could eventually undermine. The transition toward post-quantum cryptography currently unfolding inside the Pentagon is part of a much broader global migration already underway across banks, hospitals, and technology companies, all racing to update their own security systems before quantum computing potentially renders older encryption standards obsolete. In that sense, this competition between Washington and Beijing over quantum supremacy is not simply an abstract contest between two governments. It is quietly shaping the security infrastructure that will eventually protect, or fail to protect, sensitive data belonging to ordinary people and institutions all over the world, regardless of which country ultimately claims the mantle of quantum leadership when this particular chapter of the technology race finally reaches its conclusion, and regardless of how quiet or overlooked this whole shift may feel right now compared to the louder, more familiar chip headlines that came before it. What is becoming increasingly clear is that this competition was never going to be won or lost on a single technology alone. And the Pentagon's decision to elevate quantum computing alongside its ongoing artificial intelligence chip strategy reflects a more mature understanding of just how many fronts this broader technological rivalry actually spans. Chips remain enormously important, and nothing about this quantum pivot suggests Washington is walking away from that competition. But the recognition that chips alone will not guarantee lasting advantage marks a genuine shift in how American strategists are thinking about long-term technological power. China's remarkable progress in closing the domestic chip gap over just the past few years stands as a clear demonstration that raw manufacturing capacity and coordinated state investment can overcome even aggressive export restrictions faster than most analysts initially predicted, and that lesson appears to have landed hard inside the Pentagon's own strategic planning. The path forward from here will likely be defined by how effectively each side balances these parallel competitions rather than by any single dramatic breakthrough, and by how patiently each government is willing to fund a technology that may not deliver its biggest payoff for many years to come. Washington's bet on quantum technology as a complementary front to its ongoing chip strategy represents a calculated wager that scientific and engineering advantage in an entirely new computing paradigm can offset the ground already lost in conventional semiconductor manufacturing. China's own aggressive quantum ambitions, backed by the same kind of centralized state funding that powered its chip industry's rapid rise, suggest Beijing has reached a remarkably similar conclusion about where the next phase of this competition will actually be decided. Neither side has a guaranteed path to victory, and the technical challenges standing between today's experimental quantum hardware and a genuinely operational battlefield-ready quantum capability remain substantial on both sides of the Pacific, requiring years of sustained investment, careful engineering, and a fair amount of unavoidable trial and error before either country can credibly claim a decisive, lasting advantage. What is longer in doubt is that the technology competition between these two countries has expanded well beyond chips alone. And the decisions being made inside defense ministries and research agencies right now, largely outside public view, will likely determine which nation holds the decisive technological edge when this next chapter of the rivalry finally comes to a head, long before most of the public ever hears the details behind how it actually happened. Keep watching this channel, because whichever country crosses the next major quantum threshold first, whether through a breakthrough in error correction, a new fielded sensor system, or a fully operational quantum-resistant defense network, we will be covering it here the moment it happens, well before it becomes the kind of story everyone else is suddenly scrambling to explain.